My name is Madeline Pierce. I'm 34 years old. And the morning my husband prepared to close the biggest deal of his career, he acted like my only job was to sign where he pointed. Owen sat beside me at the conference table with a neat stack of documents, looking relaxed enough to order lunch. Across from us, Kelsey Monroe watched with calm confidence. Before the buyer's team came in, Owen leaned closer and told me the paperwork was routine. "Just sign," he said, "and we can finally put all of this behind us cleanly." Kelsey added that turning a business decision into a marriage problem would only make things harder for everyone. I looked at both of them, then back at the documents in front of me. I wasn't there to take Owen's company. I wasn't there to ruin the sale or embarrass him in front of investors. I had spent too many years helping build the foundation beneath that business to destroy it out of anger. But I also wasn't going to sign a statement that erased what I knew had happened. Owen seemed certain that my name on several records was nothing more than leftover paperwork from the early years. He believed the company had grown so far beyond those first decisions that none of them mattered anymore. Maybe that was why he looked so comfortable with Kelsey sitting a few feet away from me. He thought the hard part was already over. Then Simon Reed, the buyer's representative, entered with 2 members of his team and began reviewing the ownership schedule. He flipped through several pages, stopped at one line, and asked Owen a question about the first warehouse the company had ever purchased. Owen answered immediately that the property had belonged to the business from the beginning. I kept my hands still and said nothing. I knew the record he was talking about. I also knew Owen's answer was not accurate. He had just made the first mistake, and he still had no idea. 10 years earlier, Owen and I were living outside Columbus, trying to save money to feel like adults. I was 24 and working as an analyst for a real estate firm. Owen was 25, managing properties for someone else while talking constantly about owning one himself. He saw possibilities in buildings most people ignored. The first was an old warehouse on the edge of town with peeling paint, broken lights, and more empty space than tenants. Owen loved it immediately. I was less romantic, so I spent nights calculating renovation costs, expected rent, interest payments, and how long we could survive if occupancy stayed low. By the time we made an offer, the dream had numbers behind it. We used most of our shared savings for the purchase, along with money I had saved before we married. Because of the loan structure, I held an ownership interest in that property from the beginning. My income also mattered to the lender because Owen's business had no reliable cash flow yet. None of that felt unusual then. For the next 3 years, my paycheck covered most household expenses, while rent from the warehouse went back into repairs and improvements. Owen found tenants, handled contractors, and chased every new opportunity he could find. I kept tracking the numbers and warning him when a deal looked too aggressive. We worked differently, but we were building the same future. One night, after we filled the last empty unit, Owen stood in our kitchen and told me that if we ever owned 10 buildings, the first one would always remind him that we started together. I believed him. When my employer offered me a promotion that required moving, I turned it down because Owen was preparing to buy a 3rd property. I told myself it was not a sacrifice. It was a choice for the life we were building together. At the time, I never imagined that years later, Owen would describe that first property as something that had belonged to his company from day one. As the business grew, Owen spent more time at industry events and conferences where people introduced him as the man who had built everything from nothing. At first, I loved watching him get that recognition. He had worked hard, and I knew what those early years had cost us. I never needed my name in the room. What bothered me was how the story changed. When friends asked about the first warehouse, Owen stopped mentioning the nights I spent running numbers beside him. On a business podcast, he said he had survived the early years by reinvesting every dollar and living lean. I sat in my car listening, thinking about the years my salary had covered our mortgage, groceries, insurance, and everything else. I told myself he was simplifying the story for an interview. Then Kelsey Monroe joined the company as Director of Business Development. She was smart, polished, and good at getting investors to return calls Owen had chased for months. I liked her because she understood the business and never treated me like I was invisible. The problem was Owen. He started traveling more, staying later, and treating every question I asked about debt or expansion like proof that I was afraid of growth. When I told him I wanted to start my advisory firm, he said the timing made no sense because his company was entering its most important stage. I remember wondering when my plans had become less important because his were getting bigger. The first time I suspected there was something between Owen and Kelsey, it was not because of a message. We were leaving an industry dinner when I saw them walk out together toward the same parking garage. Later, Owen told me Kelsey had already gone back to a different hotel. It was a small lie, almost too small to confront. But I knew what I had seen. For the first time in our marriage, the version of events Owen gave me did not match the one in front of me. And once I noticed that gap, I could not stop seeing it. By then, Owen talked constantly about the acquisition. An investment group wanted to buy most of the portfolio, and the offer was large enough to change our lives. I paid attention because several properties traced back to decisions we made together. Owen never seemed worried. A few weeks later, I stopped by one building after a property tour. At the parking lot, I realized I had left my notebook inside and went back. That was when I heard Kelsey ask whether I could cause problems for the deal. Owen told her I had never worked for the company and that my signatures on a few properties were leftovers. Then Kelsey asked what would happen after the acquisition. Owen said that once the deal closed, he would clean up the personal side too. He promised her a place on the new leadership team and said they would not have to hide anymore. I stood there long enough to understand what he meant. It was not only that he planned to leave me, he was preparing to use money from a business I had helped support to finance the life he wanted after our marriage. Worse, he was promising Kelsey authority over a future built on assets he described as entirely his. I went home without confronting them. That night, I opened the old property files and traced the ownership history. The original warehouse still carried an ownership interest tied to me, and later refinancing connected that property to financing used for expansion. My name had not disappeared because Owen stopped mentioning it. The structure was more complicated than the story he had been telling. The next morning, I called Rebecca Stone, an independent transaction advisor I trusted. After reviewing the documents, she told me I did not need to stop the sale. Only make sure they were selling what they actually owned. Her words turned everything from a marital argument into a question of facts. That was when I understood Owen was trying to end our marriage with money from a system that still stood partly on my signature. Rebecca and I spent evenings rebuilding the history of the business. We traced the original purchase, the first refinance, the expansion loans, and guarantees. Every document connected to another, and the pattern became clear at first. Owen had expanded the company, but the growth depended on assets and income that were not his alone. The first warehouse mattered because it became the starting point for everything. When its value increased, Owen used that equity to secure financing for the second property. Later, the same chain supported more expansion. Rebecca compared it to the bottom brick in a wall, because ignoring its history did not make everything above it independent. I also found records showing that my income helped qualify us for financing when the company struggled. There were contribution statements, guarantee documents, and spreadsheets I prepared before purchases. None proved I owned everything Owen had built. They proved something simpler, that his version of the company's beginning was incomplete. Meanwhile, Owen became more confident as closing approached. He brought me consent forms and said signing early would keep the transaction moving. He promised he would make sure I was taken care of afterward, as if my interest depended on his generosity. That was when I realized he still believed my role was something he could erase when it suited him. A few days later, I crossed paths with Kelsey at the office while Owen was in a meeting. She told me that bringing old marital history into a business deal would only make things ugly. I asked how much Owen had told her I owned in the first warehouse. She hesitated, and for the first time, uncertainty replaced confidence. I did not tell her about every document Rebecca and I had reviewed. I did not mention the guarantees, refinancing chain, or contribution records in my folder. I only said I wanted the transaction to reflect what the records showed. By the end of that week, I agreed to attend the closing preparation meeting, and Owen seemed relieved. He thought my decision meant I had accepted his version of events. I had not prepared revenge, and I had no interest in humiliating him. I had prepared the ownership records, contribution history, and financing documents connecting one decision to the next. For once, I was not asking Owen to remember what I had done, because the records remembered for both of us. The meeting returned to the questions Simon had asked about the first warehouse. Owen answered that the property had been folded into the business years ago and no longer had any separate ownership issue. Simon looked down at the title review, then at the refinance records beside it. His expression changed before he asked whether Owen was certain. Owen said the old paperwork was only administrative history. Simon pointed to a refinance document that still listed my ownership interest and another record showing that one guarantee tied to me had never been fully released. Owen leaned forward and said those details did not affect the sale. Simon did not argue with him. He simply asked me whether I agreed. I opened the folder I had brought and placed copies of the ownership records and contribution history on the table. I explained that I could not sign a representation saying I had no material interest when the records showed otherwise. I kept my voice calm because there was nothing emotional about that statement. Either the documents mattered or they did not. Simon reviewed the pages in silence. Then he noticed that the original warehouse had later been used in the collateral chain supporting financing for other properties. That did not mean I owned the entire company, and I never claimed that I did. It meant the transaction was more complicated than the seller disclosures suggested. Owen turned toward me and said I was dragging our marriage into a business deal. I looked at him and said that if this were only personal, none of those records would matter to the buyer. Simon closed the folder and told everyone the transaction could not proceed under the current representations. The ownership interests, guarantees, and disclosures would need to be reviewed before closing. For the first time that morning, Owen did not have an immediate answer. His shoulders tightened as his attorney began gathering the documents for another look. Kelsey stared at him, then asked quietly why he had told her I had no real stake. Owen started to explain, but nothing he said sounded complete. No one shouted, and no one walked out. The deal had not disappeared, and I had not taken anything from Owen. But the room no longer accepted his version of the business without question. That was enough to change everything. The confidence was finally gone now. For the next few weeks, the buyer's review team examined ownership records, loan documents, guarantees, and contribution history. The result was clear. I had a documented interest in the foundation that helped the business expand, and some obligations tied to me had never been separated. The buyer still wanted the deal, but its structure had to change. My interest had to be valued correctly, guarantees had to be released, and the disclosures had to reflect how the early financing worked. Owen did not lose the company, and the business did not collapse. What he lost was the ability to control the story. The buyer now understood that the company had not begun with one man acting alone. The harder moment came during a meeting with Owen, Kelsey, and the transaction team. Kelsey asked how he could promise her a leadership stake after closing when he had not explained the ownership structure accurately. Owen said the details were more complicated than expected. Kelsey asked what else he had simplified, because it was easier than telling her the truth. After the meeting, Owen asked me to stay behind. He admitted that he had convinced himself the early years no longer counted because he was the one who expanded the business afterward. I told him I had never denied his hard work or claimed everything belonged to me. The problem was that he needed my contribution to become zero before he could call the success entirely his. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Owen said he had started believing the public version of his success because it made everything simpler. I told him simple was not the same as true. I did not need him to call me his partner anymore. I only needed him to stop pretending I had never been one. That was when the argument inside me finally quieted. I was not asking for gratitude, and I was not waiting for Kelsey to apologize. I wanted a clean separation from the business and from the marriage. Whatever came next, I wanted it to begin with the truth. The transaction closed a few months later under a structure that reflected the records instead of Owen's version. My interest was valued fairly, and I was released from the remaining guarantees tied to the properties. I did not take half the company, and Owen did not lose everything he had built. I simply left with what the documents showed was mine. Our marriage ended soon after that. Kelsey stepped back from Owen once she understood how much he had left out about the business and our marriage. I never asked what happened between them afterward. By then, I had stopped measuring my future by what happened in his. I rented a small office and opened the advisory firm I had talked about for years. My first clients were a married couple preparing to buy their first property together. They reminded me of Owen and me when we were younger. Nervous and convinced love would make difficult decisions simple. I told them to write everything down while they trusted each other completely. Clarity is not the opposite of trust. Sometimes it is how two people protect fairness before either can imagine needing protection. I learned that lesson in a way I never wanted. Still, I was grateful I understood it. For years, I thought the painful part was that Owen stopped appreciating what I had done. Later, I realized the betrayal was his attempt to rewrite those years as if my contribution had never existed. The buyer did not give me my value, and the documents did not create it. They only made it harder for someone else to erase. If you have ever felt that your quiet work was treated like it did not matter, share your thoughts in the comments. Like and share this story if it stayed with you, and subscribe for more stories about relationships, choices, and starting again. I spent years helping someone else build upward. The next foundation I chose to protect was my own.